So, how do you actually decide who a country's best leader is? I mean, is it all about charisma and just getting things done? Or is it about having the exact right skills for a very specific moment in time? Today, we're going to dive deep into that question by looking at two totally different ways of judging a leader's success.
So, we're going to kick things off with what looks like a pretty simple question, right? We've got two huge figures in Sri Lankan politics, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe. Who's better? But, as you're about to see, the answer is, well, it's anything but simple. Because, this isn't really about just picking a winner and calling it a day. It's about how we think. We're going to explore two powerful and honestly surprisingly different ways to even make these kinds of judgments in the first place. And this map kind of shows the two paths we're about to walk. Over on the left, you see a pretty straight line of thinking, right? It's like a simple pros and cons list that leads to one single answer. But then you look at the right, and it all branches out. It suggests that maybe the best leader isn't a simple answer at all, but one that completely depends on the circumstances. Okay, so let's start with the first perspective. We'll call this the Dilan framework, and it's a really straightforward approach. It basically just weighs the strengths and weaknesses of each leader right up against each other. So, from this point of view, the case for Mahinda is built on these huge, very visible achievements and personal traits. I mean, you've got the end of the 30-year war. That's the absolute centerpiece. Then you add in a strong sense of nationalism, a really charismatic personality, all those infrastructure projects you could see, and of course, that decisive leadership style. Now, if you're using that same exact yardstick, the case against Ranil focuses on what are seen as major weak spots: a perceived lack of nationalism and charisma, a leadership style seen as weak, and then, of course, being linked to big controversies like the central bank scandal. So here's the kicker. The conclusion from this perspective is super clear, it's simple, and it's absolute. Mahinda is the best politician. Period. Case closed. But is it really that simple? And this is where things get really interesting. This brings us to our second perspective, the Akash framework. And this one argues that that first approach completely misses the most important thing of all: context. And here's the core idea of this whole second approach. It basically says that trying to analyze these leaders' entire careers all lumped together is just pointless. And why? Well, because they governed under completely different national circumstances. The challenges were just not the same. So what this framework does is it slices the analysis right into two different periods. First, we're going to evaluate the kind of leadership qualities you need during a war. And then, second, we're going to look at the qualities needed after the war, when a country's priorities have totally shifted. All right, let's see how this approach builds a completely different picture. Because now we're not just comparing the leaders to each other, we're comparing them against the needs of two totally separate eras. So when you're in a time of war, this framework argues that Mahinda's qualities were just a better fit. An autocratic style, straight-up decisive decision-making, even centering power in his family were all seen as assets when you have a single military goal. He built up public trust and had that strong nationalist support. Ranil, on the other hand, was seen as weaker, and his support for democracy just didn't seem as effective when the whole nation was focused on one thing: winning the war. So for that first context, the wartime period, the verdict here is clear. A leader with a more autocratic and decisive style was seen as more effective. The goal was singular: win the war, and Mahinda's style was just viewed as the best one for that very specific mission. And right here, this is the pivot. The war ends. And suddenly, the country's needs shift dramatically. You're not thinking about national security in the same way. Now it's about economic development, the rule of law, reconciliation. So do those same leadership qualities still apply? This framework says absolutely not. And now, in the post-war era, just watch how the tables completely turn. The evaluation criteria are totally different. We're not talking about military victory anymore. We're looking at things like political vision, rule of law, economic competence. And on almost every single one of these new metrics, from ideology to corruption tolerance to protecting minorities, Ranil comes out on top. The only place Mahinda really scores is on that raw ability to lead a group. And this quote, this really just nails the whole argument of the post-war analysis. The idea is that being popular isn't the same thing as being qualified. The skill set you need to run a country in peacetime, managing an economy, strengthening institutions, protecting minorities, is fundamentally different from the one you need to win a war. Okay, so after walking down these two totally different analytical paths, it's probably no surprise that we arrive at two totally different conclusions. Let's put them side by side and see what we've got.
And right here, you can see the power of a framework in action. On the left, you've got Dilan's verdict, a simple, absolute answer. Mahinda is the best. But on the right, you have Akash's verdict, which is so much more nuanced and conditional. Mahinda was better for the war, but Ranil is better for the peace.
So, the crucial point of this entire explainer is this. The answer to who is better really depends entirely on the questions you ask and the framework you choose to use. It turns out the lens you use for evaluation can actually be more powerful than the facts themselves. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. When you evaluate leaders, or really any ideas in your own life, how much does the context, the specific time, the place, the circumstances, how much does that change your final verdict? It's definitely a question worth asking.